I'll never forget the night of 1993 when my entire world collapsed. It was late, almost midnight, inside the small office we had rented above a printing shop in downtown Chicago. The hum of the fluorescent lights mixed with the sound of the city outside, but in that moment all I could hear were his words. Jack Mercer, my business partner, my so-called brother-in-arms, leaned back in his chair with that cocky grin he always wore when he thought he was ahead of me. He looked me square in the eye and said, "Ethan, you're too old-fashioned for this world." I froze. I remember staring at him, my hands still resting on the blueprints spread out across the desk. Those blueprints weren't just paper. They were months of late nights, years of my life, and every ounce of belief I had in building something meaningful. And here was the man I trusted most, the man I thought I would grow old in business with, dismissing me like a relic from a forgotten time. I tried to laugh it off at first. Old-fashioned? Jack, you're talking about the same approach that built this company from nothing. You remember the garage. You remember those nights we worked with broken equipment and empty stomachs, sketching designs until sunrise. But his grin didn't fade. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice sharper this time. That was the past. Investors don't care about sketches anymore. They want speed, they want flash, they want to see you adapt. And you? You're still scribbling notes in a damn leather notebook like it's 1955. That cut deeper than I'll ever admit, because he wasn't just attacking my methods. He was attacking me. Everything I stood for, everything I believed in. Jack and I had built our company like brothers. He was the salesman, the big talker who could walk into any room and leave with a handshake. I was the craftsman, the strategist, the guy who made sure promises got delivered. Together, we made a perfect pair. At least, that's what I thought. As his words sank in, I thought about my family, my wife, Laura, waiting at home with our 2 kids asleep upstairs. She believed in me more than anyone. She'd tell me every night, "Ethan, you're building something that will last." My brother, Daniel, had invested his savings to help us get off the ground. He told me, "I don't care how long it takes, I trust you." I carried their faith like armor, and yet, in that moment, Jack's betrayal pierced straight through it. I tried one last time to reason with him. "Jack, I don't care what the investors think about my notebook. What matters is building a product that works, that lasts longer than a press release. You can't build trust if you sell smoke." But he shook his head slowly, like he was already done with me. Then came the words that burned themselves into my memory. "You're holding us back, and I won't let you drag me down." The next day, I discovered what he meant. With a few clever legal maneuvers and some backroom signatures I hadn't seen coming, Jack had cut me out of our own company. The ink was dry before I even knew it. Imagine that, your name stripped from the door, your voice silenced in meetings, your stake gone as if it never existed. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for, erased overnight. When I came home that night, Laura was waiting. I walked in with nothing but a cardboard box of my belongings from the office. My notebook, some pens, a photo of us from the early days. I set it on the kitchen table and said quietly, "It's over. Jack's taken everything." Her face fell, but she didn't break. She reached across the table, put her hand over mine, and whispered, "No, Ethan. He took his path. You still have yours." I wanted to believe her, but all I could feel was the sting of betrayal. The man I once called my partner, my friend, had turned me into nothing more than a footnote in his story. What I didn't know then was that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something far greater. Because sometimes, when someone burns your world to the ground, they don't realize they've just cleared the land for you to rebuild an empire. And last month, 30 years later, I walked back into that same building, bought his company outright, and gave one order: erase his name from the walls. Before everything fell apart in 1993, my life felt solid, like a foundation that couldn't be shaken. Looking back now, I realize that's exactly why it hurt so much when it crumbled. I was 36 years old, living in Chicago with my wife Laura and our 2 kids. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. Our home was a modest 2-story brick house on the south side, the kind of place with creaky stairs, walls lined with family photos, and a backyard where I grilled burgers every Sunday while my kids chased each other in the grass. I used to stand there at the grill, apron tied around my waist, and think, this is it. This is the American dream. I'm building something for them, something that will outlast me. I was a family man before I was a businessman. Laura had been with me since college. She was strong, steady, and sharper than I'll ever be. She saw through people in an instant, and sometimes I wish I'd listened to her warnings about Jack sooner. But at the time, all I could see was the dream of creating something bigger than myself. My brother, Daniel, was part of that dream too. Younger than me by 4 years, he was always the risk-taker in the family. While I calculated every step, Daniel jumped headfirst into life. When Jack and I first came up with the idea for the company, Daniel was the first to say, "Do it. I'll back you. You've always been the one who finishes what you start." He put in his savings, and I carried that responsibility like a weight on my shoulders. I couldn't let him down. Back then, the early 90s were buzzing with change. Technology was moving fast. The internet was just starting to poke its head into the world, and every young entrepreneur seemed to be chasing the next big thing. But I wasn't chasing. I believed in building slowly, methodically, like laying bricks one at a time until you had a wall that could withstand anything. That's where Jack came in. Jack Mercer was the opposite of me in almost every way. He was flashy, charming, the kind of guy who could sell ice to an Eskimo. He dressed sharp, drove fast cars, and had this confidence that filled a room. When we met, I saw him as the missing half of what I lacked. I thought, if I'm the builder, he's the voice. Together, we can do anything. And for a while, that was true. We started our company, Ward and Mercer Solutions, in a garage with nothing but a couple of desks, second-hand computers, and a whiteboard that barely stayed on the wall. I'd spend nights sketching designs in my leather notebook while Jack pitched clients with all the fire of a born salesman. It worked. Slowly, people started paying attention. We landed our first contracts with local businesses, mom and pop shops that needed systems they could trust. I'll never forget one client shaking my hand and saying, "Ethan, you're the kind of man I can count on. You don't just sell, you deliver." That was the reputation I wanted, and Jack rode it like a wave. Inside the office, though, our dynamic was different. I was the cautious one, double-checking numbers, making sure every contract was solid. Jack was the gambler, always pushing for bigger, riskier deals. Sometimes we'd clash, but we balanced each other out. At least, that's what I believed. At home, I felt like the luckiest man alive. Laura never complained about the long nights. She'd bring me coffee at midnight and say, "You're building something that matters." My kids, too young to understand, would run into my arms when I finally came home. Daniel would stop by the office on weekends just to remind me, "Don't lose yourself in this. Remember why you started." And I did remember, or at least I thought I did. My life at that point was built on trust. Trust in my family, trust in my partner, trust in the idea that hard work and loyalty would always pay off. If you had asked me back then, I would have told you I couldn't imagine anything breaking that foundation. But trust, I learned, is fragile. It doesn't take years to break. It takes one moment, one sentence, one decision made in the dark, and the man I trusted like a brother would be the one to swing the hammer. The cracks in my partnership with Jack didn't appear all at once. They started small, like hairline fractures in glass, barely visible, but slowly spreading until the whole thing shattered. At first, I dismissed it as growing pains. The company was expanding, our client list was getting longer, and Jack was pushing us into bigger rooms with bigger players. I figured the tension between us was natural. But deep down, I knew something had changed in him. Jack used to call me at midnight, full of excitement about a new idea, a new client, or just to say, "We're gonna make it, Ethan." By 1992, those calls turned into sharp arguments. He'd storm into the office, toss his coat over a chair, and say, "We're moving too slow. We're missing out." I'd point to the spreadsheets, the projects we were still delivering. "Jack, we're building solid ground. If we start sprinting, we'll trip. Our clients trust us because we take our time to get it right." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was chasing something else. Recognition, maybe, or power. Investors were circling us like hawks, and Jack loved it. They loved him too. He was the kind of guy who could charm a boardroom into signing a blank check. And I was the guy with ink on my hands, scribbling in a leather notebook like some stubborn relic. The first time he mocked me for it, I laughed. We were in a meeting with potential partners, and I pulled out my notebook to jot down ideas. Jack smirked and said, "See, Ethan's the only guy I know who still thinks a pen beats a computer." Everyone chuckled, and I forced a smile, but I saw it in their eyes. He wasn't joking, he was planting seeds. Seeds of doubt. By late '93, those seeds had grown into walls between us. One night, we were the last two left in the office. Papers scattered across the table, half-empty coffee cups around us, the city lights flickering through the blinds. Jack leaned back in his chair, watching me write notes by hand. "You know what your problem is, Ethan," he said. I didn't look up. "Enlighten me." "You're too old-fashioned for this world." The words hit me harder than I expected. I looked up at him, really looked. His eyes weren't just tired, they were cold. He didn't mean it as a jab, he meant it as a verdict. "Old-fashioned?" I asked. "Jack, these methods built the company. Do you remember the garage? Do you remember the nights we worked until dawn with nothing but that old drafting table?" He shook his head. "That was then, this is now. The market doesn't care about handshakes and craftsmanship anymore. They care about speed, about flash. And you're stuck in the past." I felt something in my chest tighten. "It's not the past, Jack. It's principle. You can't sell smoke forever. Eventually people want fire." He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Principle doesn't pay the bills. Principle doesn't get investors to double down. And if you think it does, you're dragging me down with you." That silence after his words felt endless. It was the first time I realized we weren't partners anymore. We were opponents. The next day, he made it official. I walked into the office to find legal documents on my desk. Complex, full of language I didn't fully understand at first, but the meaning was clear enough. Jack had maneuvered behind the scenes, securing signatures, making calls, locking me out. With a single stroke of a pen, he stripped me of my stake. My name was still on the door, but not for long. I tried to fight, I tried to argue, but he had played the game while I was too busy working, building, trusting, and trust doesn't stand up in a courtroom. By nightfall, I was out. I'll never forget the walk home. The cold air biting my face, the cardboard box in my hands filled with the remnants of what I thought was my future. A framed photo of our first office, my notebook, a few pens. That was all I had left of Ward and Mercer Solutions. When I opened the front door, Laura was waiting in the kitchen. She saw the box before I even spoke. "Ethan," she whispered. I set it down on the table, my voice breaking. "It's over. Jack's taken everything." Her hand found mine across the table. "Not everything," she said softly. "You still have us. You still have your hands. You still have your mind." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to see a path forward. But that night, all I felt was betrayal. The man I trusted like a brother had gutted me, and I didn't know if I'd ever recover. But what I didn't know then was that sometimes being stripped down to nothing isn't the end. It's the spark that forces you to rise again. In the weeks after Jack forced me out, I felt like a ghost in my own life. I'd wake up each morning, sit at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, and stare at the same leather notebook I'd carried for years. Pages full of designs, sketches, and ideas, none of which mattered anymore. The company was gone. My name had been scraped off the letterhead, and in the eyes of the industry, I was finished. I remember one morning in particular. The house was quiet. Laura had taken the kids to school, and I sat there in my robe, staring at that blank page. For the first time in my life, I didn't know what to write. My mind was empty, and that emptiness scared me more than Jack's betrayal ever could. That's when Daniel walked in. My brother didn't knock. He never did. He just came through the door carrying a bag of groceries and looked at me like I was disappearing. "Ethan," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "This isn't you." I didn't answer. He pulled out a chair, sat across from me, and tapped the notebook in front of me. "You still have these hands. You still have that brain. Jack didn't take those. So, what are you going to do? Sit here and rot or build again?" I wanted to argue, to say I was too tired, too broken, but the truth hit me hard. He was right. Jack had taken everything except the one thing he couldn't touch, the way I built. My process, my principles, my refusal to cut corners. That afternoon I opened the notebook and wrote 2 words: start again. It wasn't a grand plan. It wasn't a business strategy or a 5-year projection. It was a declaration. I decided that if all I had were my notebook, my hands, and the trust of the few people who still believed in me, then I'd build something new, even if it killed me trying. I rented a tiny workspace on the edge of the city. It wasn't much more than a dusty storage room with a flickering light and a folding table. The rent was so cheap the landlord practically laughed when I signed the lease. But when I walked in with nothing but my notebook, a pencil, and a second-hand chair, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: possibility. The early days were brutal. I cold-called small businesses until my voice went hoarse. Most hung up, some laughed. A few gave me 5 minutes of their time, and even fewer agreed to a meeting. I was humbled every single day, but slowly, little by little, cracks of light started to break through the darkness. My first client was a small hardware store. The owner, an older man named Frank, had heard what happened with Jack. When I walked in with my notebook under my arm, he raised an eyebrow and said, "Heard you're old-fashioned." I thought he was mocking me, but then he smiled. "Good. I'm tired of slick talkers. I want someone who shows up, does the work, and doesn't disappear after the check clears." That job saved me. Not just financially, but spiritually. It reminded me that there was value in the very thing Jack mocked me for. My so-called old-fashioned ways weren't a weakness. They were my edge. Word spread slowly at first. 1 job turned into 3. 3 turned into 5. Every night I'd come home exhausted, my hands stained with ink and grease, but Laura would meet me at the door with that same steady smile. "See?" she'd whisper. "You're building again." The struggle was real. Money was tight. I sold my car, cut every expense I could, and spent more nights in that little workspace than I did in my own bed. But each project I delivered built my reputation brick by brick. Not as the fastest, not as the flashiest, but as the man who never failed to deliver on his word. And slowly, I began to believe again. Jack's betrayal had stripped me down to nothing, but in that nothing, I discovered the most powerful truth of my life. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to realize what you're truly made of. That turning point wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about proving Jack wrong. It was about proving to myself that I still had the strength to stand, to create, to matter. And as I filled that notebook page by page with new sketches, new ideas, new beginnings, I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was the start of something far greater than I had ever imagined. Decades passed, but I never stopped building. What began in that tiny rented workspace grew into a steady, respected company. We didn't make headlines. We didn't chase trends. We just delivered over and over until our reputation became unshakable. While my business grew slowly, Jack's empire soared. I'd see his face in magazines, shaking hands with investors, standing beside luxury cars in glossy ads. He was everywhere, and for years I couldn't escape him. It stung. Every headline felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. But I buried that sting in my work. Because while he was sprinting, I was laying bricks, and brick by brick, the wall I built stood taller. By the late 2000s, whispers about Jack's company, Mercer Tech, started surfacing. Missed deadlines, broken contracts, lawsuits piling up. I didn't smile when I heard those rumors. I just kept my head down and worked. But a part of me knew, the fast money, the flashy promises, they never last. Then came the phone call. It was a rainy afternoon, and I was sitting in my office when my lawyer, Richard, called. His voice carried a weight that made me sit up straight. "Ethan," he said slowly, "Mercer Tech is going under. They're liquidating. We can buy it, outright." For a long moment I couldn't breathe. My mind went back to that night in 1993. The papers on the desk, Jack's cold stare, the words that cut me down. "You're too old-fashioned for this world." I pressed the phone to my ear. "You're telling me I can buy Jack's company?" Richard hesitated, almost amused. "No, Ethan, I'm telling you that you can own it, all of it." The silence in that office was deafening. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't spite, this was justice. 30 years in the making. "Do it," I said finally, my voice steady. "Buy it." The deal closed within weeks. Just like that, Mercer Tech belonged to me. On the day the paperwork was finalized, I drove to the building I hadn't stepped foot in since the day Jack pushed me out. The marble lobby looked almost identical to the one I remembered. Cold, towering, intimidating. But the moment I stepped through those glass doors, I wasn't the same man who had walked out 30 years before. Employees whispered as I passed, their eyes full of curiosity. Some knew my name. Most only knew the legend of the old partner who had disappeared long ago. But I wasn't there for them. I was there for one thing. At the center of the lobby stood a massive marble wall, engraved in bold letters, Mercer and Ward. My name, once erased, had been restored. But his name loomed above it like a ghost. I turned to the foreman of the renovation crew I'd brought with me. My voice didn't shake. "Take his name down." The man nodded, and within minutes, chisels and hammers echoed through the hall. Each strike felt like thunder rolling through my chest. With every fragment that fell to the floor, 30 years of betrayal, bitterness, and pain cracked away with it. I stood there, watching letter by letter disappear. MERCER gone. When the dust cleared, the wall gleamed with one name. Ward. I can't describe the feeling that surged through me in that moment. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't anger. It was closure. It was justice. I thought of Laura, who had stood by me through every sleepless night. I thought of my kids, now grown, who had once hugged me when I came home broken. I thought of Daniel, who had never stopped believing in me. And I thought of Jack, wherever he was, finally forced to face the truth. He was wrong. Old-fashioned didn't mean obsolete. It meant unshakable. It meant steady. It meant that while the world rushed to chase the next shiny thing, I was still here, building something that lasted. As I walked out of that building, the sun breaking through the clouds outside, I realized something important. I hadn't erased Jack's name out of hatred. I erased it because it no longer belonged there. That company was no longer his. It was mine, and it always had been from the very beginning. When I walked out of that lobby with Jack's name gone from the wall, I thought I would feel triumphant. I expected the rush of victory, the satisfaction of finally closing the circle. But what I felt instead was peace. For 30 years, I had carried the weight of Jack's betrayal on my back. It drove me on the hard days, it whispered in my ear when I doubted myself, and it pushed me to prove that I wasn't finished. But the moment his name crumbled to dust, that weight disappeared. For the first time in decades, I wasn't driven by anger or loss. I was simply free. That night, I went home and sat at the kitchen table where this journey had started all those years ago. The same table where I had once dropped a cardboard box of my belongings and told Laura, "It's over." Except this time, I wasn't empty-handed. This time, I had the story of a lifetime to tell her. Laura listened with tears in her eyes. Her hair had gone gray, and the lines on her face told the story of every sacrifice she had made to stand by me. But her smile was the same one she gave me on the hardest nights. She reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "I always knew you'd finish what you started." My brother Daniel came by a few days later. He walked into my office, saw the photos on the wall of everything we'd built, and just shook his head with a grin. "You did it, Ethan," he said. "You never gave up your hands or your heart. That's why you made it." We raised a glass that night. Not to revenge, not to victory, but to resilience, because in the end, that was what mattered. Over the years, people have asked me if I did it all to get back at Jack, if buying his company and erasing his name was the revenge I always wanted. And I tell them the truth, no. Jack was a chapter in my story, not the ending. He taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned: never let someone else define your worth. He said I was too old-fashioned for this world. And maybe he was right, in the sense that I refused to play by the world's cheap, fast rules. But what he didn't understand is that old-fashioned is another word for lasting, for loyal, for true. My methods were slow, my notebook was out of date, my refusal to cut corners made me seem stubborn, but in the end, those so-called weaknesses became my strength. While others burned out chasing the next big thing, I built something steady, brick by brick, until it outlived all the noise. And that's what I want anyone listening to this story to take away. Don't let betrayal break you. Don't let someone else's opinion bury your belief in yourself. You might lose money. You might lose partners. You might even lose your name on a wall. But as long as you still have your hands, your mind, and your heart, you can rebuild. I know because I did. The funny thing is, once I finally owned Mercer Tech, once the name Mercer was gone and only Ward remained, I didn't feel like I had destroyed an enemy. I felt like I had honored myself, my family, and the values that carried me through 30 years of struggle. My children, now grown with families of their own, told me they were proud. My daughter hugged me and said, "Dad, you showed us what it means to fight without bitterness." My son added, "You showed us how to rise after being knocked down." Those words meant more to me than owning any building ever could. In the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving Jack wrong. It was about proving to myself and to my family that even when life strips you down to nothing, you can rebuild something stronger, something truer, something that can't be taken away. So when I tell this story, I don't want people to focus on Jack. I want them to focus on what came after, on the resilience, on the rebuilding, on the truth that sometimes losing everything is the greatest gift life can give you, because it forces you to discover who you really are. And if you're sitting there now, feeling broken, betrayed, or left behind, I'll tell you what my brother told me all those years ago. You still have your hands, you still have your mind, that's more than enough. And that's my story. A story about betrayal, rebuilding, and finally reclaiming what was mine. If you take anything away from it, let it be this: no one else gets to decide your worth. Not a partner, not a boss, not a critic. You define it by what you build, by how you stand back up after life knocks you down. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been counted out, betrayed, told you weren't good enough? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one, and I want this to be more than just my story. I want it to be ours. If this video moved you, if it made you stop and think about your own journey, do me a favor. Hit that like button, Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. It helps us grow, and it makes sure these lessons reach people who might need them most. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and most of all, thanks for believing that old-fashioned values like trust, resilience, and hard work still matter, because I promise you, they do. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and keep building.